If Charles MacArthur and Ben Hecht were around today and thinking about a play along the lines of The Front Page, their model for Hilly Johnson would probably come out of the television industry, not from the newspaper business, and he'd probably be cast in the image of our guest tonight, whose past reads like the credits of a male lead in a soap opera. Station announcer in Grand Rapids, Michigan, actor and narrator of The Lone Ranger and The Green Hornet, MC of quiz shows and beauty contests, husband of a husband and wife breakfast show, Broadway actor, overnight sensation with New York's first tough TV talk show, and so on until several weeks ago when Time magazine named him the best news interviewer on television today. I'm Harold Hayes, and our guest tonight is the co-editor of CBS's 60 Minutes, Mike Wallace. Mike, it all really began for you about 20 years ago, right?
56.
56. That was Night Beat.
No, Night Beat did begin back in 1956.
Now, there's a whole generation that's come and gone since
I meant
then.
that I was 56 years old. It didn't begin for me 20 years ago.
But a generation's come and gone since Night Beat was with us. Tell us what Night Beat was and its meaning to you.
Night Beat was the creation of a fellow by the name of Ted Yates, now dead, who was one of the best television producers I have ever known and one of the finest men. We worked in a news department over at Channel 5 locally here in New York, Teddy and I and several others. And someplace along the line, he suggested that we do an interview broadcast together, 11 to 12 at night. And he thought maybe somewhat different from interview broadcasts which had been done prior to that. What do you have in mind? He said, well, let's go a little deeper. Let's be a little tougher. Let's maybe even be a little abrasive.
It was his word, not yours.
Well, I don't know. I think it probably was my word, but the word was mine. The creation of Night Beat really was essentially his. The close-ups, the insistence, the thorough, deep research on each interview.
Well, to put it a little bit in context, because I do think there are many people out there that don't really know about what it was. Jack Gould said at the time that it was a pioneering show because it truly offered the possibility of an adult understanding of people. Now, was that overblown in your terms? It seems to me, from my recollection of it, it wasn't, that you explored a wide range of types of people and you had a very definite technique in doing so.
We did have a technique. Jack Gould somewhat later was less, Jack Gould being then the critic of the New York Times,
Yes,
was a little bit disenchanted some years later, and be that as it may, we would talk to labor leaders and strippers, authors and baseball players, politicians and actresses.
You would talk to them,
I
nobody
would.
else, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
In the course, it was on an hour a night, 4 nights a week. It was live. We would have 2 guests in the course of an hour, start with news headlines and then go into the broadcast. It was at a time when the Steve Allen Show was on the air, and that was the only late-night competition. And for some reason, there was an appetite, it was a local show, here in New York, to hear interesting questions, tough questions, probing questions, fairly interestingly put and well photographed. And believe me, by the time you got through watching a Night Beat interview, everybody had a pretty good time. I had a wonderful time. The audience, I think, had a pretty good time too, because we had done so much research, and we were insistent, and we were even self-consciously abrasive from time to time. But the guest had a good time because he knew what he was getting into. He was coming for a wrestling match.
The hot seat
of sorts.
Originated with her.
Nobody ever walked out. Nobody ever had to be subpoenaed to come on the broadcast.
But Burt Lancaster once threatened to hit you in the nose.
Oh, well, that was later on a broadcast called PM East. That was some years.
Had
that
nothing
was
to do with that.
No, it was not on Night Beat, no.
You mentioned in an exchange with Hugh Downs about the craft of interviewing that the threshold for tolerance on the part of the audience lowered after 11 o'clock in the evening.
People are more anxious to talk and I think also to listen. After all, 11 o'clock at night, mind you, this was live, and let's say you've been out for dinner and you've had a drink or two, And we did it in a dark studio. There wasn't, I mean, you couldn't see anything but the interviewer and the interviewee and the red light on the camera. And after a while, if an interview was going well, it was as though you were sitting across the table with one person, nobody else around, with perhaps a glass of beer between you.
That's what it's all about, isn't it?
Well, if you can make that happen, that is what it's all about. And you had enough time to develop a character. That is, to develop the character of the person. And if you'd done enough research and you faced your interviewee with things that he or she had said in the past about which perhaps changed his mind, or comments that had been made about him or his ideas, you'd try to find a chink, if you will, in the facade, in the public relations facade. And sometimes it got interesting.
It was not a news show. If it was not a news show, what kind of show was it?
Well, when you say it was not a news show, what is reporting?
Conveying of information.
Okay.
Essential information.
Then it was an essential or feature information.
Well...
Sometimes it was news, sometimes it was feature.
What did you look on it mostly as being?
I had never tried to categorize it.
It was your own interest, certainly, and that of your staff, which was very, very wide-ranging for a television show in those days.
Yeah. Well, each of us was underpaid, and each of us worked very hard, and each of us had a very good time. Ted Yates, as I say, the late Ted Yates, and I'd like to, for a moment, talk a little bit about Ted.
Please do.
He was a cowboy from out in Wyoming who then had, I say a cowboy, he was a young man who was brought up partially in Cleveland, partially in Wyoming, and then later on in Palm Beach, and eventually wound up working for Tex and Jinx. And then we stole him away for Channel 5 from Tex and Jinx. And he was the news director. And he was about 10 years younger, maybe a little even younger than that, 10 years younger than I. And he taught me an awful lot. He had such intellectual spirit and such intellectual energy and imagination. We were partners for about 5 years, and then he went on to NBC eventually as a producer, produced David Brinkley's Journal, and then became a correspondent, did his own specials, won all kinds of awards, and was killed on the first day of the 1967 war. He was on the Jordanian side and was shot by an Israeli sniper.
That is spread throughout the whole staff.
Yeah.
I heard a story that when your show received the Robert Sherwood Award, that you took the $1,000, threw a party, and you all split the $1,000.
That's right. That's right. Marlene Sanders, who's now a producer correspondent over at ABC, she was the booker and general office manager and did a lot of the research. And a fellow by the name of Al Ramrus, who is now a screenwriter out on the West Coast. And then a man by the name of Lloyd Garrison, who later worked for NBC and then for the New York Times. They were most of the people who worked along with Ted Yates. And, most important of all, a woman by the name of Rita Quinn, who now works at Time Life, and who was a legal secretary and she was a fan of the show, and wrote me a note and said, "I'd like to work for you for nothing." And she did for about 6 months for nothing and then she joined our organization.
Well, you're described in Time magazine, last issue, I suppose, as the best television interviewer on the air. And certainly one reason is because of the unique style that you've developed as an interviewer. Does that trace back to Night Beat? I would assume so.
Yes, it does.
Now, you have written and talked about elements or components of that style, which fascinate me as one who watches you. And I'd like to get your amplification of these components. One is, and you mentioned many times, being interviewed back at the time of Night Beat, one of the things that made it different from other shows was preparation.
Right.
Another was the ability to listen. Another was the use of dead air. Another was, and this is the most intriguing and ambiguous to me, conviction. This, if you don't recall it, was the last of an exchange between you and Hugh Downs. The one essential quality was conviction. That familiar to you?
Maybe I'll refresh myself as I go along, because I'm not sure what I meant, and I'd have to see the piece in its context.
Yeah.
As far as preparation was concerned, I had done interviews prior to that time, but never really anything like the preparation that went into a single half hour. A research person let's say an Al Ramrus, would go out ahead of time to the interviewee, having gone through a morgue and gotten all kinds of information, and he would spend a half an hour, 2 hours with the interviewee, talking and talking and talking, finding out what is most interesting in what the interviewee has to say. Then he would come back and give me a list of questions, suggestions, possible answers, and so forth. Then I would work over that list with Al and say, well, now let's go here, but let's not do this. And I would never see the interviewee ahead of time until we walked into the studio together and we sat down. And it wasn't that I was brand new in New York at that time, but I didn't know a good many people in New York at that time, and that was better too, because you have fresh eyes interviewing somebody who is not a good friend, and therefore puts the raps on you. In any case, because I knew so much about that person ahead of time and had really carefully crafted the questions, I and the researcher and I, that the interviewee respected that and worked as a result with me. He wanted to make it good too, and he knew that I had notes there. So listening is the single most important thing that you can do, and some interviewers find it very difficult to do.
Explain that, because I think people who are not familiar with your business don't understand what appears to be a very simple aspect, which becomes quite complex in such circumstances.
Well, an interviewer is worried about the next question, the clock, the directions from the floor manager, something from the control room, his relationship with his family, whatever. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to pick up the nuances of what is being said to an interviewer by the interviewee. Therefore, he has a list of 20 questions and plows on through those 20 questions, come what may.
Regardless of what the man says
Exactly.
that he's talking with.
Yeah, and jokes have been made about this, and I suppose sometimes non sequiturs do come out of not paying attention. But if you will listen to the subtleties of an answer, the nuances of an answer, sometimes you'll pick up something in what a fellow says or a woman says.
Which is more than you might have anticipated before you...
Much more, and then you veer off your prepared questions and go on a fresh course.
Perhaps the audience will indulge a purely parochial question, and that is, when you listen and are led away from what you have prepared in the structure of your discussion, and that avenue is exhausted, how in hell do you get back to where you were so that you can carry out the structure that you were dealing with?
The easiest way in the world. You just go back to the next question. You got all those 20 questions there in front of you. Now, I see that you have, I don't know, 10, 15, 20, 30 questions prepared.
Oh, this is for another show, I say. Go ahead.
So you can go right back to them.
Yeah.
Audience will go any place that you take them, if it's interesting, if you are making it interesting, and if you care. Perhaps that's what I meant by conviction. I don't remember using the word conviction in the interview with Downs, but if you care about the person you're talking to, that caring conveys itself, I think, quite effectively to your audience. They care because you care.
Right. Well, I was very much struck by the point when it was made, and I'm not sure I can immediately... Oh, yeah, here it is. Mr. Downs, the real delight is someone who wants to tear up the floor, not to be agreeable. Frank Lloyd Wright is the perfect example, a real joy and challenge. He would lead off an answer with an airy, "My dear boy," and you knew you were working with a genuine master of stimulating conversation. That makes interviewing the most potentially exciting form of television. Mr. Wallace, it certainly does. Wasn't it Ed Murrow who once said that people armed with their own convictions can compose compelling literature while they're speaking?
Yes.
That's TV at its best in a talk, a documentary, an interview, anything, conviction.
Yes. Oh, well, that's not on the part of the interviewer. That's on the part of the interviewee.
The identity of the person and his knowledge of who he is. Is that correct?
Frank Lloyd Wright knew who he was, believed what he believed. When he came to an interview, he came to work.
He was not diminished by the experience of being on television.
No. And most interviewees, I was about to say aren't, should not be. In the final analysis, the interviewer is out beyond his depth, or should be. The interviewee is on his own home turf. At this moment, I'm talking about myself. I'm talking about interviewing. I'm talking about television. I should know. Well, when I'm talking with Frank Lloyd Wright, I was talking about architecture or manners and mores or politics or whatever, or religion or things that he had thought about, written about, of course, architecture first of all, and cared deeply about. And a little wrestling, a little jousting is not going to throw him off for an instant.
Well, I want to get to that, but first, dead air. Now,
dead air is to ask a question, and then the interviewee answers. It's a tough question, mind you. I mean, it's a question about, Harold Hayes, you ran Esquire magazine for a good many years. Did you quit or were you fired? Now, you'll answer. And then I'll say, and the interviewee can't stand that dead air. And sometimes
he tries to fill it up.
He tries to fill it up, and his pudding comes tumbling out.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't happen all the time, but occasionally it works.
How did you arrive at that?
By sheer luck.
But you recognized it when you found it.
Oh, sure.
Let me go to the next question. You used tough and provocative questions when you did Night Beat, and I would dare venture much tougher and more provocative than you do today. For example, you said to Fannie Hurst that her books were meaningless bilge.
I doubt that I said it. I probably quoted somebody else who had said it, because I very, very seldom, almost never, used my own evaluation. I would get some mean evaluation, like meaningless bilge.
Rex Stout, and this may...
But no, wait a minute, that's important.
Yes, please.
That is important, because I'm not particularly interested in most interviewers' opinions. But you become surrogate for somebody else's opinions. Christopher Lehman-Haupt of the New York Times says, and then you say something that is quite mean, what you have done is buttressed a question with criticism from a source that is considered substantial, and you've put your interviewee a little bit on the defensive. Therefore, he or she will try to justify himself. Therefore, you have a little tension going, a little drama going. And then if you can add another one and another one. Now, for instance, if you wanted to be mean to me right now, you could throw a couple of criticisms, not of your own, but of others that have made of me, and who knows, I might begin to weep.
Would you not, however, be more aroused if I simply flat out said something to you that was antagonistic or contentious? And as a matter of fact, given the philosophy of Night Beat at the time, wasn't there a greater possibility of exacerbation if you just simply confronted somebody and said, look, you're a jerk, or as I believe you said to Toots Shor, why are you a slob?
No, I said no. I would be inclined to doubt that I would say it to Toots, who was
good-natured.
Good-natured slob. Now, why do people call you a slob, or something of that? Why do people call you a slob? Because actually, he was rather proud of being called a slob at the time. Because he was a good-natured. He is a man. I mean, Toots and I were friends, and he was one of the few people whom I interviewed at that time whom I did know slightly.
How much of your technique, Mike, came from your past experience as an actor and narrator? Because you have a superb voice, and you do know how to modulate your voice and body and motions as an instrument of what you're trying to do.
I'm sure that there is an element of performance in everything that anybody does on the air. There's an element of performance, or style, if you want to call it, in writing. There's an element of style in performing on a football field. So that I started as a radio announcer when I got out of college. And back in those days, a radio announcer read commercials, swept up, did news, which you ripped off the machine, so forth. And then from there on, that was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Detroit, Chicago. Back in those days, and that was the late 30s, early 40s, before I went into the Navy and then when I came back, you did everything in radio. This was before the days of television. And when I say did everything, you did news and you did acting, and I mean, not everybody didn't, but I did. Did all kinds of things. Worked for the Chicago Sun before it became the Chicago Sun-Times. Worked for NBC News in Chicago. Did the 11 o'clock news on NBC at the same time that I was narrating. So you develop a certain facility. Later on, when I came to CBS in the early 60s, no, came to CBS in the early 50s, and in the mid-50s, was doing a documentary series on radio called Stage Struck for CBS Radio. Met a lot of people in the theater. Said, why don't you try? And I did one Broadway show called Reclining Figure back in 1950.
And extremely well reviewed in the...
Yeah, 1954, 55. All of this business helps to fill your vessel. You learn about the theater. You learn about yourself. You learn about other people. You learn how to perform.
Night Beat was an extraordinary success at the time that you did it, and it ran about a year and a half.
It ran actually about 8 months.
That's short.
Yes, Night Beat ran from October of 56 until, I think, May or June of 57. Then we all moved over to ABC, and it became the Mike Wallace Interview. Then it ran for another year and a half on the network after that.
What happened over there?
We were told, the reason that we made the move was we were told that we were going to do, in addition to the interview, the half-hour weekly interview on the network, that we would be in the news department. And the fellow who was running the news department at the time said, no, you're not. And so none of us ever uttered a word in the news department. And after a while, we had... It was a very expensive show. It was a very inexpensive show, actually, but it was expensive for just a half-hour interview, and it was perfectly apparent that we were not going to do what we wanted to do, which was to run or to be in the news department. And so after 2 years, we came to a parting of the ways. Still, Ted Yates. Our whole organization.
The whole crew moved over.
The whole crew moved over.
Well, you were guaranteed when you went editorial freedom and a year's air run.
We were guaranteed editorial freedom, a 2 years income, and a year's run on the air. And they honored that.
They did?
Oh, indeed they did.
What was the fracas over the Mickey Cohen?
Oh, that was really my fault.
Tell me about that.
Mickey Cohen came on and called the then chief of police in the city of Los Angeles a sadistic degenerate. And he called a police captain about half that. And it was live. I think that would have been all right, but they insisted, or I insisted that it be put on what was called a hot kinney, replayed, the repeat to the West Coast, and it was. He was like, he fascinated me.
Mickey Cohen did?
Yes, and I did a poor job with him.
Why? How?
I don't know why. To this moment, I don't know why. But I let him say things that I let him say things. He said things that I didn't question sufficiently. The impact, the shock impact of the statement about the chief of police of the city of Los Angeles was, as you can imagine, considerable. It took me years to live that episode down.
Well, Pete Martin had an interesting quote, seemed to me, that grew out of these considerations of style with reference to that technique, and that's, let me read this to you. He said at the time, quoted you saying, "A guest on my show must justify himself. With the TV camera trained on him in a close-up, you can actually see one of my questions hit him in the face like a flung physical object. You see my questions take hold, you see his thought processes, then out comes his self-justification, if any, or his stalling. It's a dramatic thing to watch." Now, this must have been at the point that Jack Gould, who remained a fan of yours, raised the question of whether that technique or approach did not invite the problem of dealing with bigotry or irresponsibility within that framework. That is, a man justifying himself, being put in the position of having to justify himself.
Well, I think that rhetoric that you've just repeated, I wince a little bit as I hear it played back, because it's a little self-conscious and a little bit pompous, and I was 18 years younger, or 17 years younger at the time. I don't know if you were in New York at the time.
Yes,
Harold.
I was.
Well, you remember what a huge conversation piece Night Beat was.
Absolutely.
At the time.
Absolutely swept this town.
That's right.
Never been anything like it.
Everybody listened to it. Everybody watched it, and we got a little bit too big for our britches, I think. And then I had never been interviewed before. I'd never been the object of any kind of press attention before in my life, any real press attention. And they kept asking what the technique was, what we did, how we prepared, why we were successful, and all of that. And so what I was trying to do in the piece that you quoted was can you imagine being the subject of a Saturday Evening Post profile?
Well, you handled yourself very well throughout the whole profile, I thought.
Well,
but it was interesting insofar as the question of technique is concerned, as to how you saw what you were trying to do.
The technique, again, the rhetoric was a little bit overblown.
But
basically, that's what the technique was.
And Jack Gould raised the question is, can you use that technique without running the hazards of public misinterpretation?
A public misinterpretation of what?
Well,
you're asking in the final analysis is a question.
But you can't check Mickey Cohen on the air whenever you ask him what he thinks about the Los Angeles police.
Right. And that was the only time that we got, I was about to say the only time, I think on one further occasion, funny thing happened, but one of two times in which we got into trouble because of a live broadcast in which something was said that really should not have been said because Cohen could not substantiate what he was saying.
And of course, going live,
it was settled out of court by the insurance company.
Going live, there's no way to protect against that, is there?
Correct.
Which is interesting.
On one other occasion, what happened was that I was interviewing John Crosby, and somehow Edward Bennett Williams' name came up. And we got into a discussion of Williams at the time that he was defending Dave Beck, I think, and maybe Frank Costello and Jimmy Hoffa, I forget. In any case, Crosby made some comment about him. And mind you, this was on tape, and my attorney heard it. And Edward Bennett Williams took umbrage, and he sued. And I finally got Louis Nizer to defend, who was a friend. And Nizer called me back after a while and said, Mike, I washed my hands of it. He was going to defend me for nothing. I washed my hands of it. I finally got Morris Ernst to defend. And Williams made me pay him. John Crosby would have nothing to do with it. He was then television critic for the Herald Tribune, as I remember. John Crosby didn't care. He wouldn't pay. Williams made me pay him $1,000 to
Mike,
call the suit off.
this is the end of part one. Please stay around for part two. Join us tomorrow night for Roundtable with Mike Wallace. I'm Harold Hayes.